Doctor examines baby rushed to hospital and notices something strange. When the boy who brought her reveals the truth, she can't hold back her tears. The emergency room at Boston General breathed with its usual Thursday evening rhythm, but there was nothing usual about the weight pressing down on Dr. Sarah Mitchell's shoulders. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the institutional green walls, where faded photographs of past department heads seemed to watch over the controlled chaos below. The familiar symphony of medical equipment, the staccato beep of cardiac monitors, the soft whir of 4 pumps, the distant wail of an ambulance, normally faded into background noise after 12 hours on shift, but tonight each sound seemed to pierce through her growing fatigue. Sarah rolled her shoulders, trying to ease the knot of tension between her shoulder blades. Her dark hair was escaping from its neat bun, and her hands trembled slightly as she updated patient charts on her tablet. The tremors weren't just from exhaustion. She'd skipped lunch again. A bad habit that Nancy, her head nurse, constantly scolded her about. But after losing a teenage trauma patient that morning, food had been the last thing on her mind. "You should go home soon, Dr. Mitchell," Nancy said, appearing at her side with a knowing look. The older nurse had been here longer than most of the equipment, and she had an uncanny ability to read her staff. "You've been here since dawn." Sarah managed a weak smile. Just a few more charts to finish. She didn't add that going home to her empty apartment held little appeal. At least here, in this sterile maze of corridors and rooms, she had purpose. Here, she could make a difference the way someone had once made a difference for her. As if summoned by that thought, the automatic doors hissed open, letting in a blast of February air that carried with it a sound that made every head turn, the desperate cry of a child. "Please, somebody help." Sarah looked up to see a boy, no more than 12, stumbling through the entrance. His oversized gray hoodie was dark with sweat despite the winter chill, and in his arms, Sarah's heart jumped. He carried a bundle wrapped in what looked like a baby blanket. Steam rose from his clothing in the temperature difference, and his breath came in visible pants in the cold fluorescent light. "Sir, you need to stop right there," called Marcus, the security guard, moving to intercept him. "You need to check in at—" "No." The boy's voice cracked with raw desperation. "The baby, she's not moving right. Please." His eyes darted wildly around the room, and Sarah recognized the look of someone who had reached their absolute limit. Sarah was already moving, her tablet forgotten on the counter. "Let him through, Marcus." The authority in her voice made the security guard step aside, though he hovered nearby, uncertain. The sound of the boy's worn sneakers squeaking against the freshly waxed floor echoed off the walls, creating a frantic percussion to match his ragged breathing. As he rushed toward her, Sarah caught the scent of winter air clinging to his clothes, mixed with something else, baby powder and fear. Up close, she could see the terror in his eyes. They were an unusual amber color, red-rimmed and wild with fear. His dark skin had an ashen undertone that spoke of exhaustion, and there were dried tears tracking down his cheeks. "I've got you," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and steady, though her own heart was racing. Something about his desperation triggered memories she usually kept carefully buried of another emergency room, another child trying to save someone they loved. "Come with me." She guided him to trauma room 3, calling over her shoulder, "Nancy, I need you." The harsh lighting in the trauma room seemed to intensify everything the boy's fear. The stillness of the bundle in his arms, the urgency thrumming through Sarah's veins. As the boy reluctantly laid the bundle on the examination table, Sarah caught a glimpse of his hands. They were shaking so badly he could barely let go of his precious cargo. The baby was tiny, probably no more than 3 months old, with caramel-colored skin a few shades lighter than the boy's. Most worrying was the stillness, not the peaceful stillness of sleep, but a limpness that sent ice through Sarah's veins. Her medical training kicked in automatically, but underneath it, a voice that sounded much younger whispered, "Not this time. I won't lose this one." Nancy appeared silently at her side as Sarah unwrapped the blanket. The baby wore only a diaper and a thin onesie, definitely not enough for the brutal Boston winter. The fabric was damp with sweat and something else, melted snow, Sarah realized. How far had this boy carried this child through the February night? "What's your name?" Sarah asked, her fingers gentle but swift as they began the examination. Each touch was a question. "Too cold." "Why so cold?" "What happened to you, little one?" "Marcus," he answered, hovering so close she could feel him trembling. "Marcus Thompson. Please, is she going to be okay?" His voice caught on the last word, and Sarah noticed his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. Sarah noted it was the second time he'd used it. The baby's skin was cool to the touch, and when she pressed her stethoscope to the tiny chest, the heartbeat was slower than she'd like. Each weak thump seemed to echo in Sarah's ears, a countdown she refused to acknowledge. "Nancy, get me a temperature," she ordered, then turned to Marcus. "How long has she been like this?" She kept her voice professional, but gentle. In her peripheral vision, she could see Nancy efficiently preparing equipment, anticipating needs before they were voiced. I don't." He swallowed hard, and fresh tears spilled over. "She was crying earlier, but then she got really quiet. Maybe an hour ago? I tried giving her milk, but she wouldn't take it, and then she stopped moving as much and I just..." His words tumbled out faster and faster until they seemed to choke him. He pressed his fist to his mouth, biting down on his knuckles. "Temperature's 95.1, Nancy reported, her experienced face tight with concern. The numbers hung in the air like a verdict. "Start warming measures," Sarah commanded, her mind already racing through protocols and possibilities. "And get me a pediatric 4 kit." She turned back to Marcus, who looked ready to collapse. His knees were actually shaking, and Sarah pulled over a stool with her foot. "Sit before you fall, Marcus." When was the last time she had a full feeding? The boy sank onto the stool, but his body remained tense, ready to spring up at any moment. His hands twisted in the front of his hoodie, and Sarah noticed they were chapped and red, as if he'd been washing them repeatedly. "Last night, I think? She only took a little this morning, and then..." He broke off, staring at the baby with such intensity that Sarah could almost feel the weight of his guilt. Sarah's mind was already cataloging possibilities. Hypothermia, definitely. Dehydration, probable, possible infection. But something wasn't adding up. The baby's clothes were clean, the diaper recently changed. There were no obvious signs of trauma, but there were some unusual marks on the skin that she couldn't immediately identify. Someone had been trying to care for this child, trying hard, but without the knowledge or resources to do it properly. "Marcus, I need you to tell me, are you this baby's brother? Where are your parents?" The question seemed to drain what little color remained in his face. His eyes darted to the door, and Sarah recognized the look of someone about to bolt. She'd worn that same expression enough times in her own youth, standing in front of social workers and teachers who asked too many questions. "Hey," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. His hoodie was still damp with melted snow, and she could feel him trembling beneath the fabric. "I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help. But I need to know what's going on so I can give her the best care possible. Do you understand?" For a moment, Sarah was transported back 25 years, to a night when she'd stood in a different emergency room, trying to explain to a doctor why she'd been hiding her little foster brother's fever. The same fear that had choked her then was visible now in Marcus's eyes. The terror of having a system sweep in and tear apart what little family you had managed to piece together. Marcus's lower lip trembled. He looked from Sarah to the baby and back again, torn between trust and terror. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, marking each precious second. Before he could answer, Nancy returned with the 4 kit and another nurse in tow. "Dr. Mitchell," Nancy said in a low voice that nevertheless carried in the tense silence, "I've called up to PICU. They're ready for us when you give the word. Should I contact social services?" Marcus made a small, wounded sound, like something breaking inside him, and Sarah saw tears spill over onto his cheeks. "Please," he whispered, "please don't take her away. I was trying to help her. I was trying so hard." His voice cracked on the last word, and he pressed his fist against his mouth again, trying to hold back sobs. Sarah's hands moved automatically, preparing the 4 while her mind raced. The baby's arm was so tiny that finding a vein would be challenging even if she weren't slightly dehydrated. As Sarah worked, she found herself humming softly, the same lullaby she'd sung to her foster brother all those years ago. She noticed Marcus lean forward slightly, drawn by the gentle sound. "Nancy," Sarah said, making a decision that came from somewhere deeper than medical training, "hold off on that call for now. Let's stabilize our patient first." She turned back to Marcus, keeping her voice soft but firm. "I need you to be brave for a few more minutes. Can you do that? Can you help me help her?" He nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. In the harsh lighting, Sarah could see dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. How long had he been carrying this burden alone? "Good. Now, why don't you tell me how you found her?" As Sarah worked to raise the baby's temperature and start the four, her hands steady now, drawing strength from years of practice and the urgency of the moment, Marcus's story began to spill out, piece by broken piece. His words came in rushes and halts, like a stream finding its way around obstacles. The baby stirred slightly as warm saline flowed into her tiny veins, and Sarah saw Marcus's whole body sag with relief. His hand reached out instinctively toward the infant, then pulled back, uncertain. Sarah noticed calluses on his palms that seemed out of place on a 12-year-old. What had this child been through? Outside the trauma room, Boston General continued its endless rhythm of life and death. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see other dramas unfolding, nurses rushing past with supplies, doctors conferring over charts, families waiting anxiously for news. But in here, time seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would bloom from this moment of intersection between a desperate boy, an abandoned baby, and a doctor who recognized in them both a reflection of her own past. The monitors showed the baby's heart rate beginning to stabilize, each steady beep a small victory. Sarah caught Nancy's eye and saw understanding there. Her experienced nurse had already guessed that this case would be different, that sometimes protocol had to bend a little to let hope find its way through. As she worked, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just another case. This was a turning point. She could feel it in her bones, the way she sometimes could with patients who would change her life forever. Her hands might be steady now, but her heart was racing with possibilities and fears she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in their harsh, unforgiving glare. But as Sarah watched Marcus finally give in to exhaustion, slumping forward in his chair while still keeping one hand near the baby's blanket, she saw something else in that sterile light, the first glimmer of a new beginning, as fragile and precious as the tiny life she was fighting to save. Sarah didn't know it yet, but this night would change everything for all of them. And somewhere in the vast, cold city outside, dawn was approaching, bringing with it the promise of warmth, of hope, of second chances. This time, she silently promised both her patients things would be different. This time, family would win. The harsh fluorescent lights of the PICU buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that peculiar hospital pallor that made even the healthy look ill. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she filled out the preliminary admission forms for the baby, now temporarily designated as Baby Doe in the hospital system. The tremors weren't from exhaustion anymore. They came from the effort of restraining herself from checking on her tiny patient every 2 minutes. The antiseptic smell that permeated everything in the hospital seemed particularly strong tonight, mixing with the lingering scent of coffee and fear. Up in the pediatric intensive care unit, the infant was finally stabilizing under warming blankets and 4 fluids, her color improving with each passing hour. The steady beep of monitors created a reassuring rhythm, though Sarah knew better than most how quickly that rhythm could change. Through the glass partition, she could see Marcus slumped in a waiting room chair, his body curled into itself like a wounded animal. Even in sleep, his face held a tension that no 12-year-old should carry. The institutional lighting cast shadows under his eyes that made him look older, more worn. His worn hoodie still bore damp patches from his desperate journey through the winter night. Protocol demanded she call Child Protective Services immediately. The story he'd finally shared, finding the baby behind Wilson's Market 2 days ago, keeping her secret in his bedroom while his grandmother lay ill in the next room, raised more red flags than a Soviet parade. But something in his desperate care for the infant struck a chord deep within Sarah's memories. "You're thinking too hard," Nancy said, appearing at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee from the decent machine in the staff room, not the sludge they served visitors. "I can hear the gears grinding from down the hall, the rich aroma of real coffee cut through the medical sterility, a small comfort in the pre-dawn hours." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Did you know," she said, keeping her voice low, "that he's been heating formula in a bowl of hot tap water because he read online that microwaves can create hot spots dangerous for babies? He's been studying baby care websites on his phone between classes." Nancy, taking notes in a little notebook I found in his backpack. She pulled out the notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing with a bent cover. Inside, in careful adolescent handwriting, were lists, formula temperatures, diaper changing steps, warning signs for fever. Some entries were marked with stars, others with urgent underlines. One page simply read "Don't fail her" in letters pressed so hard into the paper they'd left impressions on the next 3 pages. Nancy's expression softened as she glanced at the notebook. In her 30 years of nursing, she'd seen everything, but sometimes a case still managed to pierce the professional armor. "Smart kid. Too smart." Sarah pushed back from the desk, rolling her neck to ease the tension. In the fluorescent lights, her reflection in the window looked ghostly, superimposed over the sleeping form of Marcus beyond the glass. He knew enough to be terrified when her temperature dropped, but not enough to understand the danger before that. He's been keeping her alive through sheer force of will for 2 days. Nancy. 2 days. She thought about what they'd found in his backpack along with the notebook, 3 different types of formula because he wasn't sure which was best, receiving blankets he'd apparently purchased from a thrift store, even a small hot water bottle he'd been using to keep the baby warm. Each item told a story of desperate, determined love. The older nurse settled into the chair next to her, close enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to curious ears. "Tell me what you're really thinking, Sarah. I know that look." Sarah stared into her coffee cup as if it might hold answers. The truth was, she'd been thinking about her own past more in the last few hours than she had in years. The memories rose unbidden: nights spent checking her foster brother's temperature by flashlight, hiding medicine and cool compresses under her mattress. The terror of discovery warring with the need to protect. "When I was 13, she said finally, "I hid my foster brother's fever for almost 3 days because I was afraid they'd send him away if he was too much trouble. By the time he had a seizure and I couldn't hide it anymore." She shook her head, but the memory played anyway. The cruel fluorescent lights of another emergency room, the accusatory stares, the crushing weight of failure. "That's why you became a doctor?" "That's why I became an emergency pediatric specialist." Sarah managed a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought if I could just save enough children, maybe it would balance out my stupid, selfish mistake. Maybe I could sleep without seeing his face during that seizure." She looked down the hall toward the waiting room where Marcus slept, his body twitching occasionally as if even in sleep he was trying to solve problems. But this kid, he did everything wrong in exactly the right way, if that makes sense. Every mistake he made came from love. Nancy followed her gaze. "The grandmother's story checks out, by the way. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her oncologist is actually here at Boston General. Dr. Ramirez says she's been missing appointments. Now we know why. She has maybe 2 months left, 3 if she's lucky." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "And Marcus? No other family that we can find so far. Father's never been in the picture, not even listed on the birth certificate. Mother died of an overdose 4 years ago in a halfway house in Dorchester." Nancy paused, her voice softening. "The brother he mentioned, Tommy, died last year from an undiagnosed congenital heart condition. Collapsed during recess. Marcus was there when it happened." "Jesus." Sarah ran a hand through her hair, completely destroying what was left of her professional bun. "No wonder he couldn't bear to let go of another baby. He's been watching everyone he loves slip away, one by one." She remembered Marcus's earlier fragments of explanation, I heard crying behind the dumpster. She was so cold. I couldn't just leave her there like garbage. Not like Mom left us. Each word had carried years of accumulated pain. The soft ping of the elevator at the end of the hall made them both look up. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the purposeful stride of Patricia Chun from Child Protective Services. She'd worked with Patricia before. She was good at her job, caring but efficiently professional. Tonight, though, Sarah wished she'd taken longer to arrive. Dr. Mitchell. Patricia nodded as she approached, her practical boots squeaking slightly on the freshly waxed floor. Nancy, I understand we have a complicated situation. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion from the waiting room made all three women turn. Marcus was awake, and from his wide-eyed expression, he'd seen Patricia's arrival too. Sarah was moving before she consciously decided to, but she wasn't fast enough to prevent him from bolting. Marcus, wait, but the boy was already running, his worn sneakers surprisingly quiet on the hospital floors. He moved like someone who knew how to avoid attention, hugging the walls, ducking around corners, the practiced invisibility of a child who'd learned early that being noticed usually meant being hurt. Sarah followed, her own shoes far less stealthy on the polished tiles. She caught up with him in the small courtyard between the main hospital and the parking structure, a sad little attempt at a healing garden that mostly served as a smoking area for staff, though it was empty now in the pre-dawn chill. Dead leaves skittered across the cracked concrete, and a few stubborn plants struggled in their neglected containers. A plastic bench sat empty beneath a leafless tree, its slats covered in a thin layer of frost. Marcus stood with his back against the brick wall, chest heaving, tears streaming down his face. In the weak security lighting, she could see his breath coming in desperate clouds. "You promised," he gasped between sobs. "You promised you wouldn't call them. Everyone always promises and then they..." He choked on the words. "I promised to help you," Sarah corrected gently, keeping her distance. "And I'm trying to, Marcus. But I need you to trust me. They'll take her away." His voice cracked like thin ice. "They'll put her in the system and I'll never see her again and she'll think nobody wanted her. Just like..." He cut himself off, but Sarah heard the unspoken words. "Just like me." "Like you did?" she asked softly. Marcus slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold ground, his knees pulled up to his chest. A withered flower lay next to him, knocked loose from one of the planters. Another discarded life in this place of loss and healing. "How did you know?" "The way you look at doorways," Sarah said quietly, moving closer. "Always knowing where the exits are. The way you flinch when adults move too fast. But mostly," she sat down next to him, not touching, just sharing the space. "Mostly it's the way you're trying so hard to be the person you needed when you were younger." Her words seemed to crack something open in him. "After Mom died," he whispered, "they put us in different homes at first. Me and Tommy. He was only 4. He'd cry all night for me." Marcus wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "When Grandma finally found us and got custody, she promised we'd never be separated again. But then Tommy's heart. And now she's..." His voice broke completely. "Tell me about the baby," Sarah prompted gently. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Marcus took a shuddering breath. "I take the shortcut behind Wilson's Market to get Grandma's prescriptions. It's faster, and sometimes Mr. Wilson gives me the day-old bread for free if I help him break down boxes." He picked at a loose thread on his hoodie. 2 days ago I heard crying. Really weak crying. Behind the dumpster, there was this box." He described finding the infant, barely moving, wrapped in a thin blanket. How he'd run home with her, terrified but determined. How he'd spent his saved-up birthday money on formula and supplies, studying baby care websites late into the night. How he'd pretend to go to school but double back home to check on her, keeping her warm with hot water bottles and his own body heat when she seemed cold. "I made a little nest for her in my closet," he said, his voice small. "Used my old science fair display board as a wall so Grandma wouldn't see if she came in. His hands twisted together. "I told her stories about Tommy, about how he would have loved being a big brother to her. I promised her she'd never be alone like we were." Sarah felt tears pricking at her own eyes. "You did everything you could, but it wasn't enough." The words burst out of him. "She got so quiet, and I couldn't warm her up, and I was so scared." He turned to Sarah, his eyes desperate. "I can't lose anyone else. Please, she's all I have left." Without thinking, Sarah reached over and pulled him into her arms. He stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against her, sobs shaking his thin frame. She held him as the sky began to lighten, thinking of all the children like them. The ones who had to grow up too fast, who carried burdens too heavy for their young shoulders. "I have an idea," she said finally, when his tears had quieted. "But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He pulled back slightly, searching her face. "Why should I?" "Because I've been where you are. Because I understand what it's like to love someone so much you'd break rules to protect them." She smiled slightly. "And because I think I might know a way to keep your family together. All of it. Even the newest member." Above them, the first real light of morning painted the clouds in shades of hope. And somewhere in the hospital, a baby girl was growing stronger with each passing minute, waiting for her family to be made whole. The transition from night to morning at Boston General always reminded Sarah of a slow-motion title change. The hushed efficiency of night gradually gave way to the awakening hospital, crash carts being restocked with metallic clinks, the first coffee cart's wheels squeaking past, the gradual increase in voices and footsteps echoing through corridors. Through the windows, the pale February sunrise painted weak rectangles on the institutional floors, competing with the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. The familiar morning scents wafted through the air, fresh coffee from the nurse's station mingling with the ever-present hospital antiseptic, accompanied by the faint aroma of toast from the cafeteria 4 floors below. Sarah led Marcus through this awakening world, acutely aware of how small he seemed in the morning rush, how his shoulders hunched slightly against the noise and movement. Patricia Chun was waiting for them by the PICU entrance, her practical boots planted firmly on the freshly waxed floor, her expression carefully neutral. Sarah felt Marcus's hand clutch the edge of her scrubs, his fingers trembling slightly. But there was something else in his grip too, a determination that hadn't been there before their talk in the garden. Marcus,